Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. Good afternoon to those in the room. And for those who are joining us via Zoom, good morning from around the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever they are. My name is Amani Aljak, and on behalf of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. This talk by Shehla Arif will be run as a hybrid event, and we have live audience joining us. This is part of the consortium speaker series for 2024, and which is organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, Mellon Grant, and the grant is entitled Affirming Multifocal Humanities. So we would like to thank the consortium staff, interns, and students, and all those who helped in organizing this event, as well as we have many co-sponsors that are making many of the consortium events possible. These co-sponsors include UMass Boston Office of the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, the Office of the Dean of Faculty, Student Multicultural Affairs, the Honor College, the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security and Global Governance, History Department, Asian Studies Department, Sociology Department, and the School of the Environment. We are really grateful for them for their continued support to the consortium activities. So before I introduce Dr. Arif, our speaker today, I really would like to note some kind of information about the location where UMass and this event is taking place. So UMass and its surrounding communities are based on unceded land of Indigenous groups and homeland of Massachusetts Indigenous group, particularly the Pawtucket and the Nimiq people. And this land was stolen and possessed through very violent kind of displacement and disposition of countless number of communities and individuals. And this continues to happen until now. And in acknowledging that this land belongs to Indigenous group, we are not stopping at the point of just acknowledging it, but we are also supporting the the land back movement. So as people are still joining here in the room and in via Zoom, I would like to acknowledge a few points. Dr. Arif will take questions from the students, both here in the audience, as well as the students on Zoom. And for those on Zoom, we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section of Zoom. The chat live is open. However, it will only be open during these introductory parts and also towards the end. But the Q&A sections are open all throughout the event. We would like for those who are joining us via Zoom to introduce themselves, and at the end of the webinar, there is a survey that will pop up. Please take the time to fill the survey. And similarly, for those in the room, you notice that there are survey papers in front of your seats, and just make sure that you take the time to fill them. We'll be grateful for that. That will help us get some feedback in terms of our next speaker series. Now it's my real pleasure and kind of a distinguished honor to introduce Dr. Arif. Dr. Arif is Associate Professor of Mechanical Engineering at University of Mount Union in Ohio. She's an engineer scientist with inter and cross-disciplinary expertise in peace and justice. Her current research and teaching focus on reclaiming the goals of liberal education by emphasizing the social ecological dimensions of engineering work. And for us, it's always a kind of a special pleasure for me when we are able to reclaim many of these scientists and engineers as cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary. So it's quite a pleasure to have you. She is the lead editor of the International Journal of Journalism, Social Justice, and Peace. And her work has been published widely. Some of her publication pieces are A Real Solution for Climate Change, another one on weaving three strands towards justice-oriented sustainability education. And one of her pieces is entitled The Tale of Two Engineering Classrooms, Overcoming the Invisible Disadvantage. Before Dr. Arif starts, I just want to alert you that this webinar is recorded and will be posted to both the consortium website and consortium YouTube. So just for you to be aware that it's happening. So it's we will have a Q&A section after the event. Dr. Arif's talk today, as you know, is entitled Examining False Solutions to Climate Change, a Post-Colonial Feminist Perspective and Hopeful Inquiry. Thank you and welcome, Dr.
All right, thank you very much. This was a very generous introduction. And I'm really, really pleased to see all of you here in person. And also it seems to me that there's a pretty decent audience on Zoom. So I also wanted to, at the very beginning, thank the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights to create this opportunity to highlight voices from the ground. And this is an important phrase which is going to come in the course of this talk, and I'll explain that. This is something that I find is quite absent from the mainstream discourse. And as we talk about the concept of climate justice, it's going to become more and more clear which elements of the discourse are absent. So just keep an eye out for that. All right, so let's work with these slides here. Am I supposed to? We're not on my slideshow, right? Yeah, share screen. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Okay. And then share. All right, there we go. Okay. So yeah. All right. Okay, I wanted to move, like, just make the screen visible because these are important things. We should all be able to see that. So what I'm going to do today is going to be a combination of like my reading from the paper as well as talking impromptu, as well as showing you a couple things. So some things which are very important and I don't want the words to get wrong. So I'm going to be reading them. So starting off, I'm very honored today to present my work here, which is an outcome of my own non-traditional and non-linear academic, activist, and personal journey, navigating the forces of colonialism, patriarchy, imperialism, militarism, and occupation. I aim at understanding climate change mediated through these forces, and hence the interdisciplinary side of things. So in doing so, my goal is to unpack the root causes of current climate crisis and multiple ensuing intersectional crises. In this talk, I shall walk us through climate science and engineering methodologies premised on reductionist and positivist approaches, leading to solutions that remain as socially unjust as their root causes. So this is a phrase that I think we should sit with for a moment. But before I go any further, I would like to dedicate this talk to more than 30,000 victims of colonial aggression in Palestine, ongoing as we speak, culminating from a 75 years long occupation, and to the victims of colonial aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan, and lesser known conflicts in Kashmir, Northeast India, Somalia, and Yemen. The list is quite long. While the ongoing genocide in Gaza is a concentrated form of dispossession, displacement, and land grab, these processes are continuing on for the last 500 years. And so that takes me to a land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you today from the land of various Indigenous peoples. And we are standing today, all of us, on the traditional lands of Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples who have stewarded this land for hundreds of years and whose sovereignty has been repeatedly violated through structures of settler colonialism. So one more thing I like to say is that some of the terms, please feel free in our Q&A time, feel free to ask me to explain those. So like, for example, settler colonialism, how is that different from colonialism and so on? So this land acknowledgement, I wanted to make this point, is not just symbolic, but is the thread that weaves the three elements of my talk today. So the first element is understanding the ecological harm of colonization. The second element is understanding the uneven social impacts, acknowledged by United Nations as common but differentiated responsibility. This is another technical term used in the United Nations language, which I'm happy to explain some more later on in Q&A. And the third element is understanding the hegemony of knowledge systems that facilitate this ecological and social harm. And so like these three, when I say weave, that actually means I'm talking about intersectionality. I'm talking about the interaction of all of these things. What I find, particularly in my discipline, the intersectionality is not studied as much as it should be. And I'm gonna talk about that a little bit later on, but before we do that, I'm gonna indulge for a few moments into my own journey, because that serves as a means to understand the mechanisms by which a hegemony of knowledge systems functions. So please feel free to ask me about what do I mean by that. Hopefully it's clear during the course of this talk. So I am a mechanical engineer by training. Born in Pakistan, I studied my undergraduate mechanical engineering in Pakistan, followed by postgraduate degrees, including a PhD in mechanical engineering from the United States and postdoctoral fellowship in Canada. All right, so why am I talking about that? So nowhere in my purely mechanical engineering academic work, there was any connection made between the engineering work and ecology, let alone its impact on marginalized peoples, women, and children. What I mean by that is the impact of the engineering work. So engineering stands here for the built world. So the world where humans have interacted with nature and transformed it into where we are in many in myriad of ways. And I can explain that some more if you have questions. Okay, so my own education experience in engineering is not unique in that sense. So the engineering curricula almost all over the world are designed in that way, that they're very technical. The focus is on technical side of things with almost minimal. It's like things are changing a little bit, but like no social concerns or impacts, or even when they are, they're not from a justice perspective. So they do not really take into account the questions of power and so on. So I owe my analysis to my activist engagement, which is like outside of my academic work, with various social movements. So I'm going to walk you through a couple of those important points. So Action for a Progressive Pakistan is a collective that a bunch of expat Pakistani academics and activists formed in 2000s. And it focused on resisting forces of extremism, fundamentalism, militarization, and patriarchy, alongside countering Orientalist readings of Pakistan in the US. So it was expats in the US. So especially in the backdrop of unprovoked aggression in Iraq and continued US drone attacks in Afghanistan and Pakistan in the decade of the 2000s and early 2010s. As part of that collective, we dared to imagine a socially just Pakistan, free from corrupt hierarchies, extremism, militarization, and large-scale oppression. So it's like combating those things both back home and then dealing with the representations of the country abroad, which is playing into a narrative which justifies continued violence and aggression. All right, so the next important interaction that I had was with this collective called Justice for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It's a solidarity collective of non-Indigenous women focused on amplifying the voices of Indigenous women in seeking justice. So it is through this work that the connections of colonization and violence against women became more clear to me. So I'm gonna share with you some statistics here. So it's a bunch to read, but I would encourage you to just take a moment and try to absorb these numbers. And so as you are reading through these numbers, keep in mind that the Indigenous peoples form roughly 2% of the overall population. So in comparison to that, so that's the whole concept of disproportionality. So these numbers speak for themselves. Violence against Indigenous women and girls is disproportionate. As a new immigrant to Canada, that was the time when I was doing my postdoctoral work at McGill University. I found these numbers staggering and difficult to understand without understanding the history of settler colonialism. So drawing on Andrea Smith's work, who is a great scholar, great Indigenous scholar who helped understand all these connections. So the doctrine of discovery is premised on the varied relationships with nature that the Indigenous peoples versus the colonizing Europeans have had. So because the Indigenous peoples did not subjugate / control nature, And that's where the connection with engineering becomes quite relevant, because engineering, by its definition, functions to try to control nature. So they were deemed unworthy of holding a title to the land. So this is like, you can find the primary documents on that, which is like the basis of the whole colonization of the continent. So by extension, they were also considered dirty and inherently violable. So Andrea Smith's book, Conquest, documents various testimonies of extreme acts of violence against Indigenous men and women. And they're really difficult to read. Anyhow, but they do tell us the differing ways in which you view the world, and how the world view then translates into actions, and how the violences are justified by dehumanizing a group of people. All right, so as part of the Missing Justice Collective, I had the opportunity to stand in solidarity with Bridget Tolley, whose photograph you're seeing up here on the slide, in her long-time struggle to call for justice, to have an investigation about the murder or the death of her mother, which was like supposedly an accident by a police car. But no proper investigation was ever carried out. It was not clear what exactly happened there. And so she has been carrying on this call for justice for like over 2 decades, which is a long time for even the case to be registered and work through the court system and so on. What they did do, they carried out an internal investigation by the police. So it's like a conflict of interest situation. And so there's a vigil, 2 vigils that happen, one on October 6th every year in Ottawa, in front of the Parliament House. And here is the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who showed up, but the case barely moved, with like a bare minimum apology just very recently. In the course of all that, Bridget went on to form a collective called Families of Sisters in Spirit, which was, so all Indigenous peoples, families, it was like families who were directly affected, who had lost somebody in their, the daughters or mothers or relatives. So she formed that collective, which is like very active collective. The other vigil that happens is on February 14th every year about this issue. So now, as I was working on with missing justice, I had the opportunity to also work with Ellen Gabriel. She is a Mohawk from Kanesatake, which is an Indigenous community living very close to Montreal. This was the time that I was living in Montreal. And when I moved to Montreal, I had no idea that there were 2 Indigenous communities living just like across the river, Saint Laurent there. So Ellen was chosen by her people to be a spokesperson in the what's called as Oka crisis. Oka is the colonizer's name for Kanesatake. And in 1990, There was a standstill where the Canadian government sent its armies and police forces and besieged Oka. And the issue was, on the surface, it's like a land dispute. So they were planning on making a golf course on the Indigenous land. So the community never had ceded that land to the Canadian government. So what I want to do now is show you a short video clip where Ellen is reflecting on what happened in 1990 and her role in that. So let's see if the link works. Okay.
And we see the paths and this spot they pull out through the back way. So they realize that they're all shit that we can force to find the veterans out. They and they want us to leave this area. And I told them this is first of all, we are the leaders. And the fact that the women of the temple land and sitting on, you can take it down correctly. Okay, we're not leaving. They shot two guys and the first two went flying out on them and wind and sing off. And probably there was 20 minutes while we were looking at this. So we had to do on that. And we're running it, shooting these materials. So we and when they started shooting, I think it was it was so it was setting up. Yeah, you get bullets with a fire collar and we froze. I had to tell people this is what we're gonna do. I think the people in our community have very strong and powerful thing. But the first one to block the highway were the ASC. And they left behind them their vehicles significant for us along the way. And that vehicle really was for us. But we put an against for everything. And our fundamental human rights, food, drinking water, medicine, and so on. SU tortured men, so they became armed. It was a bit, we were the villains, we were criminals. When the actual criminals were acting no longer alive, but their enemies and they refused to intervene. It became more of a police and military intervention rather than looking at the human rights of the people from this community and not to run and to do that. I think that someone's being punished for destroying the self-education out of human rights for the world. And so I think for myself, for others, we don't want to so we need to keep this up issues because it's saying all across the board, let's talk about today, people's lives, student, parts, and all these land possessions are done because of a rich stock and the doctrine of discovery, which cannot exist in the community.
Okay, I cannot see the cross here to go back. Excellent, thank you. Thank you, Claire. Yeah, so in this short reflection, there are a bunch of themes that we can point to. And it's the more I engaged in these activist struggles, the more those themes started to make sense to me. For example, Ellen just mentioned Alberta tar sands. So as an engineer, that is something very significant, like working with the oil and gas pipelines and all that. And I think you probably were aware some 80 years ago, or less than that, North Dakota Access Pipeline was a big issue. And so to understand like the nuances of that and to look at how Indigenous peoples and the blockades that happened even at North Dakota Access Pipeline and how that was presented in the mainstream discourse in the media. So as Ellen was mentioning, criminalizing people who are trying to protect the land, trying to protect the watershed. So it's basically through this work that for me, the connection between the violence against women, erasure of a people, and ecological harm became more evident. So through the technical work, as an example, so if you just focus on the oil pipeline and Alberta tar sands situation, that is a purely environmental concern. So the issue there as an engineer, without getting into too much details, tar sands are a very, very dirty source of oil. So it's an oil which you should not even think about trying to extract. And like, interestingly, on purely technical grounds for a very long time, tar sands was not even considered a viable source of energy, of gas, because it was just like very, very hard and it's very intensive and requires a lot of water, requires a lot of energy just to extract it out and so on. So it was in the decade of 2000s and so that somehow tar sands became a thing. And then the technology did improve. So it made it somewhat viable. But the intersection with the communities and the harm that happens to the environment, because it's a very dirty process. And when you extract the oil, what's left behind is just huge wastelands. And before that, it was a land that did have vegetation and all. So, you know, just thinking in terms of the interactions of all of these different connections, it's important. So anyway, I'm going to come to the climate justice concepts a little bit later on, but I wanted to just mark that this book was where like I started to engage more deeply with the concept of climate justice, not just climate crisis or climate change, but how does it intersect with social justice concerns? All right, so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit. So this is 6 pillars of climate justice. It's Center for Climate Justice. So it's another collective doing really wonderful work, and I'm indirectly involved with them. But we'll come to these 6 pillars later on. Let me just present to you what you're looking at this slide right now are what's called in the sustainability world, these are the 3 dimensions that form sustainability. So the 3 dimensions being environmental, economic, and social. You have 3 images here in this diagram. So 3 distinct images showing 3 distinct ways in which those 3 dimensions work with each other. So if you spend just a moment, I think all these images are pretty exciting. military. And what they do is they point to how we view. So they capture the world view that I mentioned earlier on quite well. So, for example, on the right-hand side, when you see two pillars, we quite distinct. There's no interaction going on amongst themselves. In the middle, you see this overlapping happening, some intersectionality there. But then also, that doesn't capture the entire picture, because on the left-hand side, we see the environment being on the outer circle, meaning you have to maintain, you have to be able to keep the planet in order to be able to do anything else, right? But there are lots of, even that way of thinking, there's lots of embedded tensions here. And I would want to point out that the main issue here is epistemological. So it's like how we think. Oh, okay, this is not, okay, all right. Okay, I'm back here. Okay, so yeah, so in relation to, okay, so repeat them. Sure, yeah. Yeah, all right, so I was just talking about these three different dimensions of sustainability, so environmental, social, economic, and these three diagrams representing three different approaches, three different worldviews. So like starting from the extreme right, you see the three are completely distinct from each other with no interaction. In the middle, you see the interaction amongst them. But then that misses the point about the fact that you have to have the planet in order to be able to do anything else. But even that, so long as you keep these three things distinct, so the main epistemological point here is that your relationship with the world, the relationship with the nature is going to be such that you're trying to always balance one against the others. And that's not how life works. That's not how ecosystems work. So this is a big tension in how the engineering way of understanding the world works. So leading this to a zero-sum game. So okay, so let's move on. We shall come back to this later on, but I want to make sure that we work through all the major points. So I think what I want to do when I talk about, so on the extreme left, when I talked about needing to keep the planet in order to have everything else, let's take a look at that and unpack, try to understand what I mean. And I'm going to show you some data here. So what you're looking at are two plots. So the top is carbon dioxide as a function of time. And on the extreme right of this plot, what you see is the present. So 0 on the time scale on the x-axis is showing present moment, and then we're going backwards in time. So it's going all the way 800,000 backwards. So it's taking a very long view on a geological time scale. So the top curve is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or carbon molecules. The bottom plot is the temperature, the global temperature. So the temperature is measured at the Antarctica. That's the untouched, the only untouched continent, if you will. What I want you to notice is that there's a strong correlation between the amount of carbon you have in the atmosphere and like the highs and lows of temperature. So these cycles, and this is something you would hear from the climate change deniers often, that the climate is always cycling through. So what if the temperature is rising? So I'm going to show you now, so what? So what is that okay, so this plot on the left-hand side, so the x-axis is again time, starting from 1900 on the left-hand side, all the way to projection into future up until 2100. So we're looking at a 200 years time frame. So the gray curves here, which are sort of up and down, they show, so like up to 2000s. This is the actual data that we're collecting. And everything else, these like solid lines, they're projected future scenarios. And so you see a black line, a red line, a purple line, orange line, blue and green line. These are all different scenarios. And if you read the annotations on this plot, you can see, so they come from IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so essentially the black line is business as usual. And the red curve shows you if the pledges are kept, which they are not being kept. And the green line would be the best case scenario where you are able to absorb the carbon from the atmosphere, which we're going to talk about in a minute, how that is questionable. And then the blue line is more like a more realistic plan for the future to want to keep it under 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is also quite difficult now. So the main point about this is if you just plot the slope of the curve, it tells you the rate at which the warming is taking place. And so the main point, I'm going to go back for a moment, is that the rate is so fast that it's outside of these cycles. That's the point. And the point is that that fast rate is where we are going to try to understand the 500 years and 200 years of intense extraction from the earth as well as from the people. So that's where we're talking about colonization, we're talking about enslavement, we're talking about indentured service. We're talking about wage earners whose wage is stolen. There's a wage theft that takes place under a system which is exploitative, which makes people work way harder, drives them to the very limits of like human possibility, and they still cannot make the ends meet. All of that contributes to this very fast rate at which we are extracting things. So, so the scientific problem here is that so the fossil fuels that we take from the earth, they contribute carbon to the atmosphere, and that carbon works towards heating the climate. So I'm going to show you some data. So that's like the scientific side of things. But then the social side of things is that how does that happen, right? So that's where you would have to go and analyze all of these processes that have been taking place. And the main point here is this is just concentrated in the last couple of hundred of years. Humans have lived on the earth for a very long time and have not caused these problems. So that's another important point to keep in mind in terms of like thinking about it, the future direction we need to go to, which is that if something happened in the last 200 years, you can do something else to change that, right? So that's the point about how to move forward. So here I'm going to share something else with you, which is data, and it's global temperature. So the warming, I think this is good visualization because it helps us correlate. What I do is, so the data is going to start from like 1800 something. What I do 1884, and I would invite you to reflect on the significance of that date and historical significance, what happened in late 1800s. What I do is I invite students, so I'm going to play the animation. I invite my students often when I share this with them to reflect on what all was happening as the time was moving. So think about history, like 1890s, what was going on? Early 1900s. Now it's First World War time. This is all First World War. So this is the depression, the economic crisis that happened post First World War, Second World War, the atomic bombs. This is the post-colonial era. Lots of countries in the global south were now starting to gain independence from the colonizers. And 1990s. Notice, okay, so the colors, the yellows and reds mean higher temperatures. The baseline is pre-industrial time. The red is very high temperatures, 2000s. And this is where we are. It's incredible. So the blue colors represent cooler temperatures. So this is just to get you a feel for like the change and like the fast pace at which the change occurred. So here is a, I'm gonna do like a very quick 2-second recall of like greenhouse effects. Scientifically, how does it happen? I talked about it, but so in the atmosphere, you've got, so it's like the sun's temperature is much higher compared to the Earth's temperature. So the radiation from the sun comes in, you've got the atmosphere. The atmosphere has different species in it. So everything in the universe emits radiation, thermal radiation on that spectrum, but the wavelength of it depends upon the temperature. So the radiation that comes from the sun is able to pass through whatever we have in the atmosphere, but when we have more and more carbon accumulated there, carbon absorbs the short wavelength radiation, which is emitted, sorry, the long wavelength radiation, which is emitted by the Earth. So the net effect is that the heat is being trapped. So it acts as like literally a greenhouse. If you step into a greenhouse, it's warmer. If you step into your car, you experience the greenhouse effect in your car all the time. So anyhow, so that's it. This is more science here, radiative forcing of different species. We can talk about that. This is a proposed solution called carbon capture and storage. So the point I wanted to make here was how you define, as I talked about, like the worldview and epistemological erasure and so on. So if you define the problem in terms of only excess carbons, you would come up with solutions like these that just, let's just capture the carbon. On all of these chairs, you probably saw a booklet called Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which walks you through, this is a variety of solutions, which is all about thermal management. So no concern to how it's gonna interact with the crops on the earth, how it's gonna interact with the rain, and the overall climate and so on. And the question of consent, which is like the underlying theme. So some people, a very few people are making decisions, which is gonna affect a very large number of people, and they're not even invited to the table. All these things are far from being able to be accomplished. So here is some data on so who spends, so like the carbon, so on the x-axis you see GDP per capita. So in simple words, how rich a country is, and on the y-axis you see energy per capita use. So you can work through this and see, you can compare. So for example, if we look at North North America, you can see the countries which spend more carbon budget, so consume more. And there's a correlation between the richer a country, the more of a carbon budget they utilize. So the point of that, and this is something that's an animation to work with slowly. The point about that is to think in terms of what's called common but differentiated responsibility. So not everybody has the same share, but people who suffer the most are the ones who have the least to contribute to the climate change. So that's where the justice concept comes in. And I'm gonna just walk you through very quickly in the last few minutes, and we can take some time in the Q&A. The engineering design process, I talked about it a little bit already. So it's like, you know, it's a good process, very good process, but like it doesn't quite interact with social justice and such. But you could alter it, like my colleague does this thing with like critical design process, which is great. So here are the three questions that I think I'm gonna leave us with. So we should always be thinking about, so this is in relation to design and engineering design. So like who was involved in the process, who was harmed, who benefited? These questions are mostly absent in the mainstream. And this booklet that I mentioned, Hoodwinked in the Hothouse. So this is available online, free. You can download it. It documents all of the false solutions which have been proposed so far. It does a real good job. The main point about this is it's written by grassroots organizations who have been working on each one of those solutions for a very, very long time. And so my point here is that we do not, and this is a list of those wonderful organizations. They do not accept funding from any big companies and corporations and such. And so the main epistemological point that I'm trying to make here is that these people are absent from the places where the decisions about what we're going to do to the climate are taking place. So this is also from the book Hoodwinked. It talks about these two different world views. So there's this market-based versus ecological consciousness idea and so on. So I think I'm going to stop here. Are we on time? Yeah. Okay. And I'll take questions.
Please join me in Dr. Arif for this really amazing lecture. So we have about 17 minutes for questions. And for those who are joining us via Zoom, please enter your questions to the Q&A. And we will take a first round of questions from the room first, and then we'll take a round from Zoom. So hands up, and we are circulating a mic.
Yeah, I guess it. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So please feel free to ask me things about even terminology and such, because there was a lot. Yeah.
Please introduce yourself when you ask a question, and for those of you who can, please repeat their question to the audience. Thank you.
Master of Finance program student, and I have a question about what kind of energy do you think is better solution?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for asking this and giving me the chance to talk about that. So here, I'm actually gonna go back to Claire. Can I go back to my slides? How do I do that? Okay. All right, so I'm just gonna answer your question by showing you a slide. So like the quick answer would be there's no one source that you can think of as the best. I mean, the solar, wind, etc., are good because they don't supply too much greenhouse gases. They don't emit those. But then there's the issue of like storage. So you need large scale batteries for that. And so you need cobalt and lithium, which are rare earths, and they're mined under extremely exploitative conditions. So just like thinking in terms of making a shift from what we have today to just like, find another energy source, essentially continues the same colonial mindset. It just shifts. Like now instead of like oil producing countries, you're going to these other countries, like the ones that have lithium concentration, so on. So the solution though, what is a good solution? Great question. I like to think of it as this pyramid, which again is formed by like a lot of people together. So starting from the bottom, analyze, the main thing is think of reducing the load on energy. So at the very end, at the top, when you have like reduced your energy used through efficiency, through conservation, there's lots of like ways of doing that inspired from like older civilizations. Like for example, this is a completely passive method of heating and cooling, which existed in Indus Valley long time ago. So just reduce the load to the very extent as possible. And then for that little bit of leftover, then wind and solar. But then also pay for it what it costs. Like do not, rely on exploited labor where children are being used to mine cobalt which is toxic, with their bare hands on like extremely low wages and so on, so.
Can we take a question maybe from Zoom, from the webinar? We don't have any. So how about another round of questions? And I'm happy to take 2 or 3 questions together from the room. We have a lot to digest here. 1 and 2. Do we have a third person? Please remember to introduce your names.
And also, please, please remember to repeat the question, please, in audience.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I will. Sorry, I forgot about that for the previous question. But while okay, you're ready. So go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm a grad student studying it's really fascinating. I want to thank you for sharing of your own. So I wanted to ask if you see a role for academia and sort of bridging the gap between the STEM fields and human rights-based approaches, particularly within engineering curriculums, or you see it as more appropriate for that to be sort of a separate phenomenon in academic spaces, and not necessarily part of the academic space itself.
Another question?
It's Maria, I'm an undergrad in environment here, and I'm wondering how you imagine promoting or implementing more cultural-based solutions rather than the consumption or energy type that we're discussing. With energy reduction ultimately falls on to the individual, and where you imagine we can bring that to the individual level, the uptime.
Any question? One last question?
Maybe we can take one more and I can do them all together if there's another one.
Anybody?
Or on the Zoom. Okay, so I'm gonna try to do this very quickly. Thank you very much. All 3 of these are really wonderful questions. So the first question was about the role of academia and like in comparison to should we involve the academy, particularly STEM, engineering kind of fields, or just rely on activist spaces and so on. The second question was about like the cultural changes rather than having to rely only on technical changes and such. And the third question is about good governance. So I think all three of these questions are connected to each other. And I would say, so like I'm going to take on the culture part first. So I think the solution actually lies in changing how we view ourselves, our relationship with the nature and with each other and so on. If we change that, that's the first step how we're going to solve, try to attempt to have any solution. So the technical solutions are only going to go so far. And most of the times there are questions of hierarchy and like whose voices are being heard and so on. So yeah, culture is a very, very important element of how we need to move forward. Taking on academia versus activist spaces and STEM fields and so on. So I would say that engineering and STEM fields are way, way isolated and divorced from the social side of things, and particularly justice. I do see a place for academia. I think it's on us where we need to step up and do things, connect with each other, and there is a space. So like we need to connect with the activist spaces more. So something like this consortium here is doing an awesome job where it's providing voice, highlighting, amplifying that work in activist spaces, right? But in the academy, because it gives them credence then. Because that's just how the power structure is, right? Anything that comes out of the academy is going to have more credibility and so on. So continued work and like working together to the extent that's possible. I do see a place for that. Like I want to continue staying in the academy because I see some important work that could be done. It's hard, very hard, but persistent, need to be persistent.